The opinions you hear on Your Mountain from individual hosts or guests do not necessarily represent those of Your Mountain, our sponsors, or other entities we're affiliated with professionally or otherwise. You've waited long enough. Go listen to the show.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain. Hey everybody, and welcome back for another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. As always, I'm your host, David Wilms, and I've got literally sitting across the table from me, Nephi Cole.
How you doing, Dave?
I'm doing great. It is great to see you in person instead
I wasn't
of
sure you
over
really.
Zoom.
I wasn't sure you really existed anymore.
I was thinking to myself, and it's been we did one of these in person, the one with Governor Meade. We did that in person. This is the only other one since March where we've seen each other face to face.
It's ridiculous,
man.
So pandemic,
but I'm glad you're here. Glad you're still here.
I'm still here.
Mike's not here.
No, he's working.
That seems to be the case every time we want to record one of these now. He's traveling.
Yeah, he's traveling
a lot.
Somewhere.
He's always traveling, and sometimes
good
he
for
can
him.
get on. Sometimes he's in a place where he can't get on. So we're going to carry this one. Did you notice, by the way, I'm wearing some swag.
Your Mountain sweatshirt swag.
Yeah, I'm wearing a Your Mountain sweatshirt.
Yeah, well, they're available online. Where can people find them?
They can find them on our website.
Awesome.
Through the link on our website at itsyourmountain.com. And just go to the shop, and you can pick up some great stuff. I can tell you, so I got this sweatshirt, and the material is fantastic. Like it
should last at least 20 years.
For me, I may never have to buy another sweatshirt again. Yeah. It's a great sweatshirt. So,
well, congratulations.
Thanks. So it might look a little pricey when you look at it online. You might think, yeah, that's kind of pricey. But in this instance, you're getting what you pay for because
it was a gift, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was a birthday gift. Yeah. But it's a great gift, and that you make a good point. Your Mountain gear makes a great gift.
Great gift for people.
Yep. So head out there and get it. Also, while we've got your attention, we haven't done this in a while, so I'm going to ask you again today. Go out there. If you haven't done it yet, go out there and rate this podcast. Give it a 5-star rating. Give us a review, a solid review. That's the kind of stuff that keeps us going, that keeps us motivated to put out content. And so we'd really appreciate you do that. If you have feedback for us, if you want to, if you got ideas for topics, that sort of thing, reach out to us. Find us on social media at the handle at It's Your Mountain, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and then send us an email too. We check that on occasion. Yourmountain at itsyourmountain.com. So we'd appreciate all of the love you can throw our way. We have egos that need to be fed, since we don't generate the revenue to feed our egos off of this. Mm-hmm. We do it off of support of our listeners.
Yes, I have no idea why we do this.
I'm starting to wonder too.
Oh, well, we'll keep doing it.
But we're going to keep doing it. And I'll
now
tell
it's
you,
habit.
Here's why we keep doing it, because we have things like this that we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely.
Right. So, in fact, there are so many things we could be talking about, and maybe we should do. We had somebody reach out and ask us to do a podcast about the fires.
I think we should,
and so I think maybe we should do something on that. And there's some other topics floating around there too that maybe we'll take on in the next couple of weeks. But this one is really timely as well. Next week, actually this week. So when this podcast airs, so this podcast will drop on a Tuesday like it always does. The next day on Wednesday, the Senate, U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee is going to have a hearing on Wednesday morning. That hearing is going to be on a bill involving the Endangered Species Act that Senator Barrasso of Wyoming introduced yesterday. Well, as we're recording it, introduced the week before the hearing, right? So he just introduced this bill. He's the chairman of the committee, and he's going to have a hearing on this bill next week. Now, why would we want to take this up as a topic? Because if you follow Congress at all, Endangered Species Act bills are introduced all the time, relating to the Endangered Species Act. So why would we want to take this up?
Because you love the Endangered Species Act, and this is like your favorite thing in the world to talk about. That's my number one guess. But there are probably other reasons to bring it up too. Could it have something to do with the history that we have with this issue?
Yeah, I think that's a big reason.
Yeah.
So let me start. Can I start it with this? I am increasingly frustrated, and that's putting it mildly. I am increasingly frustrated by the polarization within Congress and just the broader community in the country on the Endangered Species Act and whether or not we should be passing any bills to make any changes to the Endangered Species Act.
I'm going to go one further than you.
Okay.
And say I'm increasingly frustrated by the polarization because it doesn't matter whether or not, in my mind, there are so many relevant, good, important issues that need to be dealt with, and they're all falling prey to partisanship. And it's disappointing. It
is. It absolutely is. And this is just another example of that. So this is one example of that. But here's what really frustrates me. And then we'll get into talking about the more of the details behind it. There are bills introduced every Congress wanting to amend the Endangered Species Act. And there are here's the issue. Like it's all talking points. It's all talking points. So I can already tell you this hearing is going to happen next week, and I can already tell you what the sound bites are going to be from both sides of the issue. I can already tell you what the press releases are going to say from the organizations that are going to support or oppose this bill. And it's so frustrating that that's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to predict it right now. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to have one side of the aisle. You're going to have one side of the aisle that says, look, the Endangered Species Act works. 99% of the species that were ever listed are still with us today. They haven't gone extinct. The Endangered Species Act works, right? They're going to say, really, the only problem with it is we're not funding it appropriately. So we need to fully fund the act. And if we fully fund the act will work because 99% of the species that were ever listed are still with us today.
Yep.
The other side of the argument is, well, only about 2% of the species that have ever been listed have been delisted. And so the act is an abysmal failure because we need to be recovering species. And clearly we're not doing that because only 2% of them have ever been recovered to the point where they can be delisted.
Yeah. Well, and let me say, everything you just said was true on both sides.
Yeah, but everything I just said is also wrong or incomplete.
That's right. And that's the issue. Because both sides can bring these talking points and people want to, claim that the other side, we got a bunch of liars over here, we got a bunch of liars over there. No, we don't. We have people who, they're telling the truth. They are looking at it from a certain point of view, but it is not the complete picture. But if you could put those two sides together, you realize what you just said is yes, the Endangered Species Act we've got 99% of the stuff that we've got on that list is not going extinct. That's a success. That's something to celebrate. On the other hand, the other side is saying, we can't get stuff back off. That's true too. We're not getting stuff off the list, which means we're not recovering those endangered and threatened species fast enough. Both of those things are true. None of those things, and that's the problem with the current climate, is it's not allowing us to say, well, you know what, he's kind of right. Well, you know what, he's kind of right. Okay, now let's run towards the middle, towards each other, and figure out how to work together to make us both right and happy.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is it takes a talking point without the context. And so let me give you an example. So I want to tell you why each of these arguments is both right, like you've pointed out, but also wrong or incomplete, right? So on the only 1% of the species that have ever gone extinct, on the legally speaking, that's perhaps true. I think the number that have formally gone extinct, or that the Fish and Wildlife Service has formally said, yeah, they're extinct, is something like 10. Maybe it's 11 now, of all species ever listed. But there are something like 85 other species that are probably extinct, right? That probably have gone extinct. And we haven't made the legal classification to say, yep, they're gone. So that number actually might be higher than 1%, of species that have gone extinct. There might have been species that were put on the list that were extinct at the time they were put on the list, and we haven't been able to make that final call. All right, so there's that. Then there's the other side, the 2%, only 2% have recovered or been delisted.
Been delisted.
Okay. A species doesn't recover overnight, right? It's not like you list a species and then the next day that species recovers and that you can delist it. It can take years. And for some species that are really slow reproducing and have massive threats to their habitat, it might take decades, right? When you dive in a little deeper, you find that if a species has a recovery plan, a document that's to be the roadmap to recovery, the species that have recovery plans are largely meeting the metrics to recovery to move towards delisting.
And that's important.
And that's really important. But the other piece of it is that there are over 400 species that are listed that don't actually have a recovery plan. They're just sitting in purgatory. So you don't have a path to delisting. You don't know how to do it. So is it correct that only 2% have been delisted? Yes, but a lot of the listing happened in the last 25 years. It didn't happen early in the act. So,
other thing to note as part of this argument is there's an active effort to keep stuff from coming back off the list, even when it meets the objectives that were outlined at the beginning.
Well, so that's a separate discussion too. So there's two things there. One is there are probably about 36 species that are still listed that have met their recovery objectives and probably could be delisted. But because of the limited resources of the agency, they're focusing more on the listing side, and rightfully so. Like if they have limited resources, they need to focus on preventing the extinction of those species that are at risk of going extinct, right? So they can't spend the resources to delist a recovered species. So it just sits there in that purgatory of being recovered but can't come off the list, right? So that's one piece of it. And then maybe one thing you're talking about is that there are active efforts to prevent the delisting of some species through litigation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I want to offer some clarity to that, because I actually did some recent research on that. And this is something we're going to talk about when we talk about this bill. There's going to be a hearing. But I actually did some recent research on this. And there have been, I'm pulling up the number right now because I want to get the exact number that have been delisted correct. Right. There have been, apologize here, it's taken me a second to find it. But it's
okay. I'll play with your dog while I'm moving.
Yeah, you can play with my dog that barks in the background while we're doing this, right? Here we go. So there have been 59 species, and it might be up to 60 now, but 59, 60 species that have been delisted because of recovery to date. So one argument we hear a lot from, and this is from one side of the aisle as well, the reason to need to have this bill is we can't get a species delisted even if it's recovered because it's perpetually litigated, right? Here's an interesting thing, an interesting fact. Of those 59, 5 of them that have been delisted were actually challenged through litigation. Of 59. So it's not like it's every species is sued, 5 of them. But it's the 5 that they were. When you hear the 5, you'll be like, now I see why.
It's the one that everybody hears about.
So gray wolves in the northern Rocky Mountains, Louisiana black bear, stellar sea lions, northern Virginia flying squirrel, and bald eagles. All of these species are delisted right now. But they went through litigation to get there, and sometimes, in some cases, decades worth of litigation to get there.
So those are delisted species that did have litigation. Okay.
Right.
I have another question, but I don't know if you have
There are 3 other species that were proposed for delisting but have not been delisted because of litigation, right? That continue on that litigation fight, right? And that, those are gray wolves in the Western Great Lakes, grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone area, and the Preble's Meadow jumping mouse.
So here's a question for you, and I don't want to ruin your train of thought, but how many resources do you think we've spent on those 8 species? How many dollars, how many man hours do you think have been spent on those 8 species that either A, are recovered, or B, are arguably recovered and should be taken off the list because,
Well, I can tell you with grizzly bears, it's close to $50 million.
$50 million
just
worth
that with that one species alone.
Just resources just like lit on fire and gone.
I wouldn't say lit on fire and gone. I mean, a lot of it went to research and work on the bears and helping to recover. I mean, it's been work to recover. The state has spent. That's the recovery work.
Okay,
right?
not the cost of litigation, and man
that's
hours
a different,
and things like that.
I couldn't tell you how much that is.
Yeah.
It's been a lot, but I couldn't. Yeah. I don't have a quantification of that.
Yeah. But that's an important number too for people to look at. $50 million. What does it cost? What does it cost to recover a species?
It depends on the species.
At least $50 million
for that species.
For that species, and those numbers, was that Wyoming's numbers or everybody's?
No, that's Wyoming's.
So that's just Wyoming, and you're talking about a species that at least 4 states are involved in, probably doing very similar work.
Well, I'd say 3 states. I'm talking grizzly bears, right?
Yeah,
so Montana,
sorry.
Idaho, Wyoming.
Yep.
And Wyoming certainly has spent the most, and I know that to be true on recovery. But the federal government contributes a little bit of money as well. So they're state agencies and federal agency. But let's talk about that's just my pet peeve here. Like that. The thing is, the Endangered Species Act in a lot of areas has really worked well, and I think Democrats and Republicans alike will admit that there are places where it's worked really, really well. But the act was adopted by politicians, right, in 1973, and then amended multiple times since that point. And I don't know a person, and I don't know if you do, I don't know a person that's going to say politicians are infallible. They write perfect legislation.
Their laws are always spot on.
Their laws are always spot on.
No problems.
And there's never anything you have to fix.
No.
Fact is, the act was passed in 73, and then it was litigated and immediately amended in 78. And then it was amended again in 1982. And the amendments in a lot of the litigation issues we have today are because of the amendments Congress made in 1982 to try and address a problem that they didn't see coming from 1973. Right? So one of the issues that we have today are what you hear this sue and settle, like people filing lawsuits or petitioning for hundreds of species to be listed, organizations that will petition for the listing of hundreds of species at a time. And then when the Fish and Wildlife Service can't meet the deadlines on those petitions, then there's a suit, and then there's a settlement, and those agencies work with, or those organizations that sued work with the Fish and Wildlife Service on a settlement to help prioritize that workload and how they're going to deal with the petitions. And then they get paid their attorney's fees afterwards because they just won this lawsuit, right? That was born out of the 1982 amendments, that litigation problem. And those amendments were dealt with pretty rapidly to respond to what was a perceived political issue of an administration not being responsive enough or taking too long to deal with petitions that came in. And so Congress said, well, we're going to put a timeline on it. Yeah. And so they pick an arbitrary date and they say,
a stick.
We're going to say, okay, you got to figure it out in 1 year. One year seems reasonable. 1 year. Well, as it turns out, 1 year maybe wasn't a reasonable time frame. And so now you have all of this litigation born out of this. And so my point of saying that is nobody can tell me with a straight face. And if they try, I just look at them and I just know they're full of it. If they say the Endangered Species Act works brilliantly and it doesn't, there's nothing we can do to make it better except to throw more money at it. On that point, this idea of we have to fully fund the act, and if we fully fund the act, it'll work.
Then everything gets fixed.
Okay, let's assume that is true. I have asked this question I'm about to ask you. It's more rhetorical, but I'll ask you. I've been asking this question for...
You're going to be really upset if I have the answer.
I will. Actually, I'll be thrilled if you have the answer.
Okay.
I've been asking this question of groups that have said that if you just need to fully fund the act. This is the question I've asked for the past 5 years when I've visited with people from those organizations. What does that mean? How much money are we talking about? What does fully funding the act mean?
It means, see, I do have your answer.
Good, because I've never heard an answer to it.
It means an unlimited amount of resources to address an unlimited amount of potential concerns. It means that and this is part of the challenge of the act. It really is. And it's one of the challenges that are faced by a number of the environmental policy acts that were instituted at the same time period, which is that it assumes that everything is equal, everything has unlimited value, everything, it must be saved at all costs. And it sounds strange to say that, but the challenge of that is, in the real world, it doesn't work that way unless money is unlimited, unless horsepower in terms of your people and your agencies is unlimited, unless your knowledge is unlimited. And so while it makes, in a strange way, it makes you feel better to say, like, yes, we're going to do everything we can and tackle it with everything that we've got. The problem is, when you hand that basket of responsibilities and expectations to a given individual, they can't do that, or a given agency. They can't do that because they only have so much money and they only have so much time. And that's the issue. It's an impossible ask.
Well, and I will tell you, I've asked that question and I've never received an answer of saying, let's at least start with this dollar amount and see how that works.
It's because as soon as you put that line on it, they say, well, we might need more.
I actually think it's because it's a talking point. Because the Endangered Species Act has become so political and so polarizing that it's a talking point, but nobody's actually done the research to determine what that number should actually be. Right? So they don't actually know.
They don't know what they'd even begin to ask for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't think they know what they want to ask for. So anyway, I just spent a lot of time kind of airing grievances, like my problems, like recognizing that that people that say the act is broken are wrong. People that say the act is perfect are wrong. The truth is somewhere in between. Like the truth is the act in a lot of instances has worked really, really, really well. And it's recovering species. It's recovering other species. It's done some great things. But you can point to examples where the act has failed people. You can point to examples where the act has actually failed species. And if that's the case, you should be able to have a dialogue about, okay, are there ways to make it work better?
I want to say that one of the challenges that the act faces is being loved to death in this way. Because those people who care about the act so much that they're scared to see it change, they're scared to see anybody touch it, but they allow the problems with the act to persist because they're too scared to go in and change and amend and fix, gives a whole lot of ammunition to interests that really would like to see the act done away with, because you're creating these problems that are fixable, and it gives people ammunition to go after the act and to say, see, it's broken. See, it'll never work. And it's really unfortunate, because if you really cared about the act, then you got to see you have to care about it enough to let it be improved. So now I'll get off my soapbox.
Right. And I think you touched on a point, and it's a nice segue into talking about this bill. There's a genuine fear amongst the community that doesn't want to see the Endangered Species Act amended. I think if you pulled most of those people aside and talked to them, they'd actually say, "Yeah, it can do better. The act can work better. We just don't trust Congress to not make it worse." Right? That even if a bill on paper looks pretty good, they don't trust the process, the congressional process, to not make it worse and have us in a worse position. And they don't want to be on the record supporting a bill that at the end does worse for wildlife. Right? And that's an indictment of Congress to some extent. Right? And hopefully not a permanent indictment, but it's also an excuse. And I don't like the excuse, but that's because we've been working on endangered species stuff for years. And so I want to let's tell you why we're talking about this bill in particular. So you're going to see all these talking points we just talked about. You're going to see press releases blasting the senator as being hyper partisan and trying to gut the Endangered Species Act and do horrible things for wildlife. And then on the flip side, you're going to see this is overdue. We got to have, we got to fix this broken system. And thank you for being a champion of this, Senator Barrasso. And it's going to divide on very partisan lines, and it's going to be a very partisan debate. And you'd think it's just like every other ESA bill that you've seen floated out there that just falls into these partisan camps. But here's where we have the benefit of being able to provide you some context. Here's why you listen to this podcast, right?
Yeah.
Because we can tell you
how this all started.
We can tell you the rest of the story. Yeah.
So and this is the history I think is interesting. Yeah. I don't want to pat too many people on the back, but 8 years ago or so, the governor of Wyoming, Matt Mead, put together an energy strategy, and one of his primary goals in that energy strategy was the Endangered Species Act, to work to make the Endangered Species Act work and work to make it better. And that was one of his first and most important initiatives in his plan for energy, environment, and economy. He called it the Wyoming Energy Strategy. Was this idea that you can live in this country, and you can also make it better environmentally and through conservation. You can do both of those things at the same time if you do it right. And I think that's about the time that you came on to work with Governor Matt Mead. Right.
And let me give you a little bit more, too. One of the reasons why he wanted to talk about the Endangered Species Act and work on improving it. Remember that at the beginning of this, the number of species I told you, how very few of the species that are delisted are actually litigated? They disproportionately fall in one state, though.
No, and that's
I mean, when you look at that list, now bald eagles are all over the country, but they were in Wyoming, so that affects Wyoming. Grizzly bears, wolves, Preble's meadow jumping mice. I mean, I listed you just a handful of species, and almost half of them that have ever been litigated occur in the state of Wyoming.
Yeah, it really makes it feel personal.
And so you can see why, from the state of Wyoming's perspective, they think this system isn't working real well, because they seem to be on the receiving end of a lot of the litigation, because frankly, the state has so many charismatic species that people around the country care about, and want to see forever, right? And don't want, partially they don't want them hunted. There's all sorts of reasons why, but that they're focused on them. But it's the blessing and the curse of being a Wyomingite, right? You have all these incredible wildlife
places
resources,
and species that everybody loves.
Everybody loves them.
Yeah.
and so anyway, so with that backdrop, like you noted, the governor wanted to take this on. And in 2015, due to a resignation of a governor in Oregon, surprise resignation, Governor Mead took over the chairmanship of the Western Governors Association, which is a consortium of 19 Western states, and their governors work together to try and develop policy to leverage the voices of all the Western states to influence policy on regional and national levels. And as the chairman, each chairman gets to pick an initiative, something they want to focus on as an organization for that year of the chairmanship. And he picked the Endangered Species Act.
I think it's worth noting when you say that because his opportunity that got moved up a year, that also bumped other people up a year, including Steve Bullock from Montana. And I know with certainty that there was discussion between these two governors about two vexing problems that were affecting both of their states. And we're going to talk about another one later, right?
Right.
Because it was forest management. It's forest management.
That was Governor Bullock's initiative.
That's right. And those two governors sat and talked together and talked about having their timelines moved up and kind of shook hands and high-fived and said, yes, I'm going to take on ESA, and yes, I'm going to take on forest management, because they were critical issues to all Western states, but particularly there were ones that those two governors, a Republican and a Democrat, both agreed that they wanted to tackle, and they're both polarizing, and they're both, they both elicit these, logging, right?
Well, you're seeing it today with all the fires in the West and all the conspiracy theories and blame and politicizing.
Yeah.
Can't get the word out of my mouth. The politicizing of that issue. Right?
It took a great deal of courage for those guys to say, like, yeah, we're going to work these issues, but we're going to work them in a bipartisan way. We're going to work them. We're not going to work them to score points. we're going to work within the Western Governors Association to develop a consensus among all these Western states about how we can make these things better. And that's exactly what Meade set out to do.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Like no bones about it. Like he was saying, here are the issues we're facing, and I would like to figure out a way to tackle them. But I want to do it in a bipartisan way, and I want to be in a big tent kind of way.
Yep.
And so he started this multi-year process. I mean, this isn't something that happened overnight, and it wasn't done behind closed doors.
No, it was consensus building.
It was consensus building in a very transparent way that we actually stepped out as the governor's office. We kind of stepped out a little bit, and we brought in a third-party disinterested facilitator to lead those discussions. We invited anybody that wanted to attend to participate.
All the stakeholders to the
Any
table.
stakeholder all over the West, all over the country, from the most extreme sides of the issue to the more centrist views. Everybody was invited, and everybody participated. And over the course of a couple of years, it was actually about 3 years worth of these very frequent get-togethers and facilitated discussions and narrowing the issues down and refining language. They came up with a broad policy statement after the first year that was adopted by governors. That broad policy statement then in the second year was narrowed down and said, okay, let's get specific.
Yep, it became specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based goals,
Yes.
which I do want to pat Governor Meade on the back again and say this is something that he brought in, and he started this process with he did it throughout his administration with his energy strategy, his water strategy, his outdoor recreation strategy, and everything that he did. He utilized this process. I do know where that process came from, but he utilized this process to rather than be like, oh, I'm the guy in charge. I came up with the ideas. He was willing to give away ownership and say, you know what? We're going to let you all come up with the ideas, and I'll help this process along. But let's get everybody at the table. These don't have to be my ideas. They can be your ideas. That's the success. Because by bringing everybody else in and being willing to say like, oh, I'm not the smartest guy in the room. This guy over here on the left has some really good ideas and he's smart. This guy over here on the right has some really good ideas and he's smart. By being willing to bring all those cooks into the kitchen, you're really able to get a better dish at the end of the day, something that everybody could be happy about having to eat.
Right, and which is what happened. And the second year, this specific dish that you're talking about, the items on it, it were broken into a couple of categories. One, very specific scalpel-based statutory recommendations. Like, here are a few places where we think you should change the statute of the ESA to make it work better. Then there were, here's some regulatory ideas, and here's some funding ideas. Like, here's some things you should think about from a funding standpoint. And so there were these three buckets of ideas that if implemented, working with the executive branch and the legislative branch, right? If put together, the idea was this package will do right by wildlife and will do right by people too. And so that was sent to Senator Barrasso because he was the chair of the Committee of Jurisdiction over the Endangered Species Act and also happened to be the junior senator from Wyoming and worked very closely with the governor's office.
I think it's worth backing up and telling people who were in those meetings. You talked about those consensus building meetings.
Yeah.
The types of people that were in those meetings were who?
Yeah, you had, environmental groups, you had ag groups, you had industry groups, you had hunting organizations.
Yep. And these weren't these weren't groups you've never heard of.
Oh,
these
no.
were the big groups.
Yeah, the big groups that everybody knows of all over the country.
The most reputable, respected, powerful entities in these realms were all in the room together and all said, seems like a pretty good idea.
This is something we can work on.
And the Western Governors Association, through everybody, in every governor, when these recommendations came out, signed on. Maybe you could better clarify that.
I know because it's public information that the first recommendation, the first resolution was passed unanimously because that was out there publicly. We're not allowed to release how the votes came out on the later ones. There's there's sort of a code with that, how that works to protect the anonymity, the
Absolutely.
integrity of the process. And so I won't say how those votes came down.
But it was endorsed by the Western Governors Association.
It passed, and in order to pass Western Governors Association, it has to have, I believe it's 2/3 at least of the governors sign on in support of it. So it was adopted by Western Governors Association.
The same thing happened at the National Governors Association, where Meade was chair of the Natural Resources Committee, was that they specifically looked at the Western Governors Association recommendations and as a group, likewise endorsed. The governors there endorsed what came out of Western Governors.
Yeah, they adopted very similar principles, a little different, shorter, not as much detail.
More referencing rather than the detail. They just said, we support this effort that came out. Right. The ESA is important, and the stuff that came out of Western Governors Association is legit and it's good.
So based on this body of work and the reports that came out of it, and I haven't checked recently to see, but the reports have always been available on the Western Governors Association's website, which is westgov.org, westgov.org, and you can find the chairman initiatives and the reports from those initiatives. And I don't know if enough time has passed that one's not there anymore, but it's worth going out and looking because it's transparent. All the notes from the sessions are there. You can see what ideas were flowing, and the resolutions that came out of it are there. So you can see all the work that went into this over the course of several years. So by the time this got to Senator Barrasso, this wasn't a partisan document that came to Senator Barrasso.
It was as bipartisan as it can possibly be.
Right.
Because it came from, again, the whole group of Western governors. And that's across the political spectrum, and then the National Governors Association. And guess what? They're all, that everybody's there. It's not like 3 governors who call themselves the National Governors Association.
Right. And you can't pass things on partisan lines. These policy resolutions, they have to be, in fact, usually
they don't separate into partisan. They don't separate into partisan groups. It just is different in the Governors Association.
And they have to be sponsored. They have to be it's like a bill, right? Think about it like a bill. These resolutions that go through like the Western Governors Association, they have to have a Republican and a Democratic governor co-sponsoring a resolution first before it can even be discussed and voted on by other governors. So it has to be bipartisan before it can even come up for a vote.
Yeah, it's worth noting at the Natural Resources Committee where Meade was the chair, and that Jerry Brown, from the governor of California, was his vice chair, and they swapped several times, working together for multiple years, Meade and Brown together. And if you can't look at the contrast in those two states and those guys working together on projects is impressive.
I agree. And so that's a little bit of the backstory of how this idea wound up on Senator Barrasso's desk. And to his credit, he said, well, there's this swell of support for this. I'm going to work on turning it into a bill. So he took that process that the Western Governors did through that Western Governors Association process, and he re-engaged those stakeholders. And he put together, he had an initial hearing where there was no legislation discussed. It was just an ESA hearing talking about some of the lessons learned, things that came out of the Western Governors process, and opportunities for improvement. And then he worked with the same stakeholders that had been involved in the Western Governors process, or many of the same stakeholders, on a draft bill. And rather than, and this was back in 2017 or might have been 2018. I'll get the year wrong. It all blends together a little bit. But he had an opportunity to introduce a bill back then if he wanted to, right? But he didn't. He had a hearing on a discussion draft of a bill. He said, we've had enough talking about this. Let's get something on paper what this might look like in bill form and put it out there for the public to consume. And what happened? Exactly what I said at the very beginning of this podcast. People just blasted it as gutting one side, blasting it as gutting the ESA, right? I mean, it was just this absolute assault on it. In fact, it was kind of frustrating because some of that came from groups that participated in the process and were kind of supportive of some of the recommendations at the time. But the second that it got to Congress, they pivoted around, and then it became this partisan thing again. And that was frustrating to me as somebody that just, when a process works, you want to see it work all the way through. But so he has this bill, this discussion draft, and he has a hearing on it. And then from there, they say, okay, now I want to get feedback on that discussion draft, and let's try and make it better. And better meaning, let's find some bipartisan support here.
Let's talk with you about your concerns, and let's try and resolve them.
Right.
Let's see if we can't resolve concerns and find a path forward.
And then see if we can find a Democrat that can help co-sponsor this and make this a truly bipartisan bill in Congress and try and move it. So he actually hosted a series of roundtables where he invited all of these stakeholders to come in and have a discussion about this bill. He also, in addition to that, he had some congressional staff briefings. I participated in some of those to provide information and context about the process that led to this point and some of the language in there and where it came from and why it's important. Right. So then he has this hearing, and then he has these roundtables where I think more than 100 groups show up to the roundtables and provide input and feedback. And between that point and now, then there are also a lot of behind the scenes conversations, revising ideas and so forth. And it comes out, and so he revises it. And if you look at the bill that he's having the hearing on versus the discussion draft, there are some of the same concepts in there, but there have been significant changes based on the feedback that came. Now, here's what I will say. This bill is not perfect. And just like no bill is perfect, there are some issues with this bill that frankly, if they don't get resolved, it's not moving forward. So here are a couple of the ideas. Just so let's talk about a couple of the ideas in the bill really quickly before we wrap this all up. So because we talk about it, we haven't said what's actually in it, right? And you can see just how crazy some of these ideas are. Remember how I mentioned that there are somewhere over 400 species without recovery plans?
Yep.
And that everybody recognizes that the agencies are resource limited. And so it's hard to put together recovery plans if you don't have the resources to do it. So one of the ideas here was, well, look, when Congress passed the act in 1973, if you look at the legislative history of that, if you look at all the congressional reports and the reports that came out of committees about that bill, what the picture that was painted very clearly was that the only way this act was going to work effectively and to maximum effectiveness was if the states were really like authentic partners with the federal government. There's this recognition that the federal government could provide this uniform system, but as far as implementing and recovering species, none of that was going to happen if the states weren't engaged partners and working on the ground. So that was the intent of Congress, that states should have a really active role in this. It hasn't really played out that way in a lot of cases. In some cases, it certainly does. But in a lot of instances, maybe it doesn't. Some of the ideas that were here, holy smokes, it was, let's do recovery planning. And if a state has the resources and the ability and wants to lead a recovery team and write the recovery plan, which, by the way, would still have to be signed off on by the Secretary of Interior. It's not like they do it and just go on their own way. That they can do that.
You're giving the state ownership of its problems. So you're giving it the opportunity. You're doing exactly what you should do if you want goals to be achieved, which is rather than saying, hey, I know everything, I'm sitting at the top of the pyramid. You go down the pyramid and you say, okay, who's got the resources? You're now responsible. Tell me how you are going to fix this problem, and you're accountable for it.
But you're only responsible to the extent you want to be. So it's not a mandate on the states to do anything.
It's an opportunity.
It's an opportunity for the states that have the resources and the want to take on that responsibility.
Which in most cases, guess what? They want to do it.
Well, and for some species, they certainly will. And for some, maybe they won't. But it's up to the state.
Yes,
right?
And many states, not all,
right.
I'm sure, but many states have done what Wyoming's done and said, like, you know what, we need to, like recovering wolves, recovering bears, the sage grouse issue, which never got to the listing. They said, you know what, we're going to do this. And in fact,
the right thing to do.
And as you know, the way that Wyoming handled the sage grouse challenge, the way that was dealt with, also shaped the thinking about how we can improve the Endangered Species Act and how we can do this better. I really love not just that they have recovery plans in there, but also the implementation teams.
Right.
It's saying not just like, we're not just going to have a fuzzy plan that's going to make, they're saying, you know what?
We're going to put it to work.
Here's who's actually going to do what on the ground. And to me, That is how you get things done. It's actionable conservation.
And you have the recovery plan that's developed by scientists, right? And then the implementation team takes the work of the scientists and saying, here's scientifically, using the best scientific information available, what's necessary to recover the species. And then the implementation team says, here's how we're going to do that.
Exactly. And that's where you brought in local governments, and you brought in farmers and ranchers, and you bring in resource professionals who are working on the ground. That's the implementation team, people who can take it from an idea down to best management practices on the ground that actually can work in specific situations on a specific piece of land. You know what the talking point's going to be on this, though? It's a giveaway. The federal government is giving away its authority, giving it to the states, and the species wouldn't have been listed if the states hadn't messed up in the first place. So why are we putting them in charge here? Which is it's a backwards argument, but and it's just patently false. It's just empowering the states to do more to the extent they want to, but there's still the backstop of the Endangered Species Act, and it actually still all has to run through the Secretary of Interior and that office. And what's lost on people when you look at things, whether it's an endangered species or whether it's a stream that's identified as impaired in the Clean Water Act, is if you don't get local buy-in, if you don't call it whatever you want, your implementation team, if you don't get that to occur, and that is inherently a local issue, you're never fixing anything. It doesn't matter what you say from the top. If you can't get buy-in of Joe Boots on the ground, you don't fix anything, ever.
70% of the land in this country is privately held. If you can't get the support of the private landowners on species recovery, you know what's going to happen? If they view the act as more of a hammer than a carrot, or a stick than a carrot, they're just not going to tell you if they have the species.
You become the enemy.
Right.
You're no longer a partner in the conservation of species, a partner with, and that's the difficulty from a federal agency perspective, as a guy who used to work for one. If you don't see yourself inherently as a partner to the person who actually owns all the ground and is providing the habitat for the species, you can't get anything done because you actually don't have the capability to do it without them. Right. You need their resources. You need their buy-in because they're the people who the animals and the habitat depend on.
So there are other things in the bill, and I'm not going to talk about, there's a lot of different things in the bill, that recovery planning, recovery teams, the implementation part, that's all in that bill. And you'll see that hammered, right? One of the only other thing I'll mention here, there are a lot of other things and we just don't have the time to touch on them all. But the one that's probably the piece that's the most controversial, and I'll take the blame for this. The piece that's the most controversial. There's a language in there. We mentioned how these litigation issues on delisting are so challenging to some states, especially a state like Wyoming, where these species wind up in perpetual litigation. So there's a proposal in there that would say, all right, it's a litigation moratorium, but not a prohibition. It's a moratorium until the end of what's called the post-delisting monitoring period. So effectively what this says is once a species is delisted, there's a trigger in the Endangered Species Act that says the federal government monitors the state for 5 years.
Yep.
And before they're just like, all right, I'm out. But for that 5 years, there's what's called this post-delisting monitoring period. It's actually a minimum of 5 years. And what this says is it says you wouldn't actually be able to sue until the end of that monitoring period to challenge the delisting. Right now, you can sue immediately.
Day number one, before any work has ever been done on the ground. It's just basically you're suing on the paper trail, not on the actual results on the ground.
So this, and I'll admit, this was something that I penned with a friend 6-7 years ago, and we put into the bill. Actually, I think it was a friend gave it to me and said, hey, here's an idea. And I worked with it and said, all right, we can work with this. And so I actually worked to get that put into all of this, into the whole process, and it wound up in the bill. And so this piece, which then I didn't see coming, is an absolute poison pill for folks. Absolute poison pill, just absolutely toxic. And it's my fault.
That's what you see as being the one that
guaranteed. That is the most toxic provision.
Well, thanks a lot, Dave.
And it's It's
great idea.
my fault. I'm going on the record saying it's my fault.
I remember talking with you about it. So I am not the friend that Dave was talking about. But 6 years ago, we discussed it in detail. Because it's such a frustrating thing working at the state level on these types of issues. Again, no matter what the issue is, it's very frustrating when you can't you can't even measure whether or not you're doing the right thing or getting the work done or recovering species, because you just anticipate you're going to get hit immediately no matter what, and nobody can tell whether or not your recovery plan was good enough or going to work. It's just disappointing. And so it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, and so I won't talk about it today, but I've come up with some other ideas that I've floated out there to address that problem in a different way, because I know how toxic it is. There's another provision. The last thing I'll talk or mention, then we'll wrap things up. There's another provision in there that so in 2016, it was during towards the end of the Obama administration. One of the ideas was we got to resolve this sue and settle issue, these petition litigation cases, like these species that are petitioned and then we sue over and we get this huge backlog. So the Fish and Wildlife Service sat down with most of the litigants in these cases and put together a proposal to address that, and came up with what they call just the National Listing Work Plan, or the 7-year work plan is what we call it. And they adopted it in 2016, and they've been implementing it successfully since. And it has broad support from the environmental community, including the most litigious side of the environmental community and the ag community, and everybody in between said, yeah, this is working, and it's rather than an arbitrary 12-month deadline for making a decision, you're prioritizing your decisions based on your resource needs and the needs of the species, and you're putting them in these buckets, the species in these different buckets. And if states are doing conservation work, you're going to allow that to happen for a while before you make a listing determination. If they're really circling the drain, you're going to look at those species first. It was a common sense approach, and it had broad support. So the senator, and it was endorsed by the WGA process, so the senator put it in his bill. And I guarantee you that
the same
those groups that loved
idea
it when it was an Obama proposal are going to hate it when it's a Barrasso proposal. And that's the kind of stuff that's frustrating to me, right? It's a good idea. It's been working well. It's common sense. And it actually improves the act and gets away from something arbitrary to something more substantive and tangible. And it's going to be, that one's going to be, hopefully there's still support for that, but I'll bet you'll see some attacks on that too in the bill. But anyway, we tell you all of this to say it's going to look like a partisan bill. It is, and you're going to see people attack it as though it is. But it's got a lot of history going into it, and so my hope is that Senator Barrasso lays down a marker here. And continues and allows this discussion to continue. Look, this isn't going to get a markup. This isn't going to get a vote in this Congress. We're right at the end of the year. It's not going to happen. But it could tee up a conversation in the next Congress, and maybe pieces of this bill can be pulled out and put into other bills, and maybe you can find a way to actually make some improvements to the act. Because despite what you hear, the act is neither broken nor perfect, right? And there's got to be a middle ground and a place that people can come together and say, look, we should put politics aside and actually do better for wildlife and do better for the people that live in these places with the wildlife. My 2 cents, or 10 cents, or however many cents this has been.
I look forward to seeing what's going on. I think that the folks who are working on this issue deserve, they deserve a pat on the back for being willing to attack this in a pragmatic way and in a bipartisan way. And so, kudos to all those senators who are willing to look at it as something bigger than political.
And the people, the organizations, not just the senators, but the organizations that are willing to recognize that it's worth having a conversation about this, and it might take a while to get there, but
not just a conversation, it's worth fixing.
Yeah.
If you care about wild things and wild places, and you do, then you have to step back and say, look, we either make stuff better and we're willing to talk about it and teach and educate, or we risk losing it.
Yep.
And that's, it's worth doing.
I agree with you. We're going to watch this closely. We'll circle back with everybody listening and let you know how the hearing goes and what goes on with this bill. But there's some context for you. Sometimes you don't get context around these bills. We want to provide you a little context today. If you have questions about this, shoot us questions. If if we weren't clear enough, we can do a follow-up on this. There's all sorts of things we can do with it. It's our podcast after all. But in the meantime, thanks everybody for listening. Check out that hearing. It'll be on the EPW website Environment and Public Works website next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. I believe is when it's scheduled. Maybe it's 10 a.m. Eastern. I shouldn't have said that on here. Look it up. It'll be on that website. I should have known before I said it. Anyway, go check it out and check out that bill. And as always, remember that life is about experiences, so go have one.